Hey, and welcome to The Explainer. You ever look at the world and wonder if all the cultural shifts you're seeing are just happening by accident? Well, today we're diving into a book that argues they're not. It's called The Marketing of Evil, and the author, David Kupelian, makes this really provocative claim that destructive ideas are being intentionally and expertly sold to us just like any other product. So let's get into his case.
So the whole argument of this book really hangs on a surprisingly simple idea, one that the author says came from his own 8-year-old son. Evil is live spelled backward. Now, from that one single thought, Kupelian builds his whole definition. He says evil is basically anything that opposes the life force, and he argues that the people promoting it are masters of deception, building their entire case on layers and layers of lies.
Okay, so that leads to the book's big central question. If this is really a marketing campaign, then who are the marketers? What are their techniques? And maybe most importantly, why are so many of us buying what they're selling? The author's answer is that it's a calculated, sophisticated PR effort, and we're about to look at exactly how he thinks it all works. All right, so the first big campaign the author talks about is what he calls the killer culture. And this one, he says, is aimed squarely at young people. The core argument here is that rebellion and even self-destructive behavior are being deliberately packaged and sold to kids and teens. And to get this point across, the author brings in this really powerful metaphor from communications professor Robert McChesney. It frames the entire teen market as like a new continent for corporations to go in and colonize. But in this conquest, the weaponry isn't what you'd think. It's culture itself. You know, the films, the music, the fashion. From this point of view, the goal is pretty simple. Capture the loyalty and, of course, the wallets of an entire generation. Kupelian, he makes this really concrete with a story from his own life. He talks about his young son wanting to wear a choker just because his older cousin had one. And he uses this simple little example of peer pressure to illustrate a much bigger point, that trends that seem totally harmless can actually be a gateway. They can become the uniform of a youth culture that, in his view, is pretty much designed to constantly push the boundaries into more and more extreme territory.
This is where we see the kind of marketing language the author is talking about. The book argues that even really shocking behaviors get packaged with a spiritual rationale. Something like body suspension is framed as a way to conquer one's fears, or tongue splitting gets sold as something that triggers a freeing on a spiritual level. So the author's whole point here is that almost any behavior, no matter how extreme, can be rebranded and sold as a form of enlightenment.
Okay, so the next campaign the author outlines is what he calls the media matrix. In this part of the book, he argues that the press plays this crucial role in creating an illusion that we all mistake for reality. And you can probably guess from the name, but he pulls his central metaphor right out of the movie The Matrix. His argument is that, just like Neo living inside a simulation, modern audiences are living in a media-constructed prison for your mind. And this prison, he claims, is built by selectively showing us information that shapes our worldview and, more importantly, hides a bunch of uncomfortable truths. So to back this up, the author digs into a pretty specific political example. This slide shows what Kupelian presents as major contradictions between John Kerry's public platform during the 2004 campaign and his actual Senate voting record. Now, for the author, the main takeaway here isn't just the alleged contradictions themselves. It's his assertion that the media, by and large, just ignored them, and in doing so created a kind of distorted, matrix version of the candidate for the public. So what's the motivation behind all this, according to the book? Well, Kupelian offers up a spiritual explanation. He argues that as traditional faith starts to decline in people's lives, they naturally look for a substitute, and that substitute is often the government. The media, in his view, both reflects and actively promotes this shift by favoring big government solutions in a world where God is no longer seen as the ultimate authority. And this idea doesn't just stop with the media. The author argues that this same kind of campaign has taken over other major institutions, and he points to the education system as his main case study. So the book lays out this timeline to show how, in its view, American education really went through this massive ideological shift. He says it all starts with early schools like Harvard, which were founded on a religious worldview. But then it shifted to a secular view, that man was perfectible just through education alone. And this, in turn, he argues, paved the way for progressive educators who wanted to totally reshape schools to serve a new kind of social order. And this quote right here from educator John Dewey, it's presented as a kind of smoking gun. The author interprets Dewey's words, "The tragic weakness of the present school,"
as a call to move away from an education that's all about individualism. In the book's analysis, this was part of a deliberate push to create schools that would train children for a collectivist society, a system that the author directly equates with socialism.
All right, so after laying out this whole case, this really detailed critique, what's the solution? I mean, what does the author propose we do about it? Well, the final section of the book offers a pretty specific antidote for reclaiming the culture.
Well, the solution he offers is actually really personal. It's all about the family. He argues that this so-called culture war is really won or lost right there in the home. The first step, he says, is the magically liberating power of parents just being honest and confessing their own failings to their kids. From there, he's a huge advocate for homeschooling to create a kind of protected cultural bubble. And finally, he calls for a return to faith as the family's ultimate foundation.
So when you boil it all down, for Kupelian, the main strategy to fight back against this marketing of evil isn't really political at all. It's cultural and spiritual, and it's centered on the family. He presents homeschooling as the single most powerful tool for parents to reclaim their role as the #1 influence on their kids' values, protecting them from what he calls the insanity of the popular culture.
And that really brings us to the book's final big challenge. After walking us through all these arguments about culture and the media and education, the author leaves you, the reader, with a really powerful question. Have the bedrock principles of a great civilization been systematically swapped out for a grand deception? And he leaves it up to you to decide if you've bought into what he calls the marketing